Welcome to the Clothe in Glory campaign, where we hold gender justice conversations. This is one of 7 episodes that are available on YouTube. You can find the rest of the videos in our playlist under Clothe in Glory.
So today, as I mentioned, we'll be talking about climate justice, sustainable fashion, and the ways that our clothes are made, the ways that our clothes are discarded, and how we can make sure that our choices around that and the corporations and industry as a whole, that we're holding them accountable, that those ways are creating a sustainable world that pursues climate justice. So with that, there's 2 Bible passages that we want to discuss together as a group. So I'll read the verses, and then our speaker will give a little bit of context around why we chose these verses for today's conversation. So the first one comes from Isaiah 61, verses 10 through 11. It reads, "I will greatly rejoice in the Lord. My whole being shall exult in my God, for he has clothed me with the garments of salvation. He has covered me with the robe of righteousness. As a bridegroom decks himself with a garland, and as a bride adorns herself with jewels. For as the earth brings forth its shoots, and as a garden causes what is sown in it to spring up, so the Lord God will cause righteousness and praise to spring up before all nations." And then a similar verse in the New Testament is Galatians 3, verses 25 through 28. It says, "But now that faith has come, we are no longer subject to a disciplinarian, for in Christ Jesus you are all children of God through faith. As many of you as were baptized into Christ have clothed yourselves with Christ. There is no longer Jew or Greek, there is no longer slave or free, there is no longer male and female, for all of you are one in Christ Jesus." Hear a little bit from our speaker, Lizzy Case. She's a writer, theologian, founder of Arrayed, a people first planet-focused Christian apparel brand with inclusive sizing and liberative spiritual slogans. She's a Do Good X alum, an Invested Faith Fellow, and her writing has appeared in our own Sojourners magazine, as well as Word and Way and other publications. And we're very excited to have her come and share around all of these intersections. So Lizzy, if you want to go ahead and give us some context for why we chose these verses to be discussed today.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks so much for that kind introduction and for inviting me to be in conversation with y'all today. The big thing I think that to just think about at this point, before we dive into kind of what we'll discuss later for these verses, is to think about this idea of righteousness. There's a term for it. One of the words in Hebrew can be translated as sort of a right relationality or right relationship. So being in a state of right relationship. And so I think the thing to kind of reflect on for these verses is to think about how that state of right relationship is reflected through our clothing, through our actual physical clothing, but also through kind of this idea of putting on and clothing ourselves in righteousness. Yeah, really excited to be in conversation with all of y'all today and talk about some of the connections between faith and climate justice and fashion. There is a lot there. It's a big topic. And so we're going to try to cover some of the main points and main connections, and we'll have some time at the end for kind of diving into more specifics if we'd like that. I do want to mention, though, before we dive in today, that I am calling to you from the traditional homelands of the Luiseno and Kumeyaay peoples, in what is now currently Southern California. So I think it's really helpful for us to start by talking about what climate justice is and kind of defining that for our conversation. So climate justice is a particular lens through which we look at climate change that recognizes the disproportionate impacts of climate change on low-income folks and communities of color around the world. One really salient kind of recent example of this is the situation that's happening in Pakistan right now, with all of the really intense flooding and kind of destruction that's happening due to that. Pakistan as a country has emitted less than 1% of the planet warming gases that are now in the atmosphere, but are considered the 8th most vulnerable nation in the world to the effects of the climate crisis. So that's kind of a recent example of this kind of definition that we're talking about here. And so this lens of climate justice also looks to provide solutions that address the root cause of climate change while simultaneously prioritizing input from and the well-being of frontline communities to create a more equitable future. So the folks who are really kind of bearing the brunt of this need to be involved in the conversation in kind of moving forward and what that kind of restoration looks like. And so one piece of this is why talk about people in context of the climate crisis, right? Why not just talk about the environment? Well, humans are a part of nature. We're not separate from it. So it's not really like we can talk about the environment at the exclusion of people. We're all part of this planet and its ecosystems. We all depend on it for its well-being, in non-human nature included. So we're all part of this kind of greater ecosystem that needs this kind of holistic perspective to move forward in a really equitable way. Next slide, please. So then how does our faith connect to this issue of climate justice? Well, it is an issue of justice. Our faith calls us to work for justice. I mean, we all know this verse, Micah 6:8, where we're called to do justice, love mercy, and walk humbly with God. I mean, this is just kind of in the warp and the weft, if I'm going to use a fabric metaphor of our faith, this idea of working towards justice. And in terms of the climate crisis, the world's kind of wealthier nations have really gained a lot of vast political and economic wealth through the exploitation of natural resources and through colonization, and have left many other countries to kind of suffer the worst effects of the climate crisis, like we talked about in the case of Pakistan this week. So in order to create more kind of resilient systems, in order to create a world where the disproportionate effects of climate change are felt more equitably, and sort of the people who and the communities who've contributed more are kind of responsible for kind of doing more to kind of help rectify this situation. And, the justice that we seek as Christians really seeks to restore this relationship between humans, communities, and all creation, and is really rooted in Jesus's command that we love our neighbor, right? This kind of idea of who our neighbor is, I think, is really important when we think about faith and climate justice, because loving our neighbor means caring about the effects of climate change. It means caring about the ways that and working to act in ways that are really meaningful to help mitigate these effects. An eco-theologian that I really love is Larry Rasmussen. He's an ecological theologian, talks a lot about these kind of climate issues, and he defines our neighbor as the articulated form of creation to whom justice, as the fullest possible flourishing of creation, is due. And so we work towards holistic solutions that kind of promote this flourishing, this relational justice from our faith kind of towards the climate crisis, and thinking through that as we move forward. So then how does kind of clothing fit into all of this? Well, in a lot of ways is the short answer. From kind of beginning to end, the clothing system is really kind of deeply entrenched in supporting the inequitable economic systems and kind of the fueling the climate crisis as we see it now. And starting just with kind of conventional agricultural methods of producing cotton and other textiles and fibers often leads to soil erosion and to biodiversity loss. Additionally, a lot of the places that are where cotton and hemp or other fibers are grown are are already experiencing and will continue to disproportionately feel the effects of the climate crisis. Again, another example just from this week is there's been a huge amount of disruption to the cotton industry, because from Texas to India to Brazil to China, there all of these areas where cotton is traditionally grown are experiencing massive heat waves, droughts, just kind of a lot of stress in the environment of actually physically producing the materials that create these clothes. So that's just one kind of example, again, from this kind of area. Additionally, a lot of clothing that we wear now is not made from natural materials. It's made from synthetic materials, and a lot of that are actually derived from oil. Like polyester, for example, is actually ultimately an oil-based material. And when polyester is washed, or kind of when it goes through waterways and things, that it sheds microplastics and sheds these kind of microscopic little plastic particles into the water, and which are bioaccumulating up the food chain and are gathering in these waterways. Like they've done studies on, the San Francisco Bay, like the sort of parts per million of kind of microplastics, and actually have found, even in recent years, that there's been evidence of microplastics in human placenta. So it is actually like, it's a problem that is affecting us and affecting the environment as well. Additionally, the fashion industry, kind of talking more about the climate justice side of things, the fashion industry operates on these kind of traditional colonial and extractivist lines. So what that means is as the majority of our clothing is produced in the global south, from kind of growing the textile or growing the fibers to kind of knitting the yarns that are spun into textiles that are then cut and sewed and produced and kind of shipped. Much of that happens in different areas in the global south, and then that clothing is consumed in the global north. So there's still this kind of process of extraction that's happening, and consumption that's then happening in the global north. And garment workers, we've talked about this on previous Clothes and Glory calls, but garment workers face already just a huge number of hardships in terms of gender discrimination and harassment, job insecurity, very low wages, and are kind of just already in a precarious position. And then the climate crisis will exacerbate that in terms of just shutting down some of these production places where clothing is produced. Like if there's a typhoon, and a few years ago there was a couple of typhoons that came really quickly through the Philippines and shut down the garment manufacturing sector there pretty hard. It's just kind of will exacerbate the conditions that they're already experiencing through, forced migration or kind of displacement and things like that. And then finally, just, one other part to talk about with the way clothing is connected to all of this with climate justice and our faith is that, clothing overproduction and then clothing waste is becoming a really huge problem. Actually, Sojourners and another author did a great article on this earlier this summer that talked about the Chilean desert and the kind of mounds of clothing that are happening there. And so what's happening often, if the clothing is consumed or shipped to the global north, it's either, not sold, or it's worn once or twice and then discarded. And then that's kind of shipped back to different places in the global south where it's just discarded and kind of left in heaps. And that's happening, as I said, in Chile, and it's happening also in places like Ghana. There's a big market that processes secondhand clothing. That's like millions of bales of clothing per year, and it's just insane, the amount of clothing. I think the most recent statistics that I heard was something like 80 billion garments are produced per year for 8 billion people on the planet. And there's just no way we can use that much clothing, right? And so all of that waste then goes and kind of contaminates different landscapes, and it kind of breaks down local tailoring sectors, and it just has a lot of different ramifications. So in talking about clothing like this, with all of these things, one of the reasons I think clothing is such an interesting kind of concept or material item to like really talk about climate justice and faith through is that clothing is a really powerful embodiment of our relationships to the earth, to each other, and I would also argue our divine relationships. So, we talked about these verses earlier about being clothed in righteousness and putting on Christ. As I mentioned, this kind of idea of righteousness can be translated from the Hebrew Bible as a state of right relationality or right relationship with our neighbor, with God, and with the earth. And, clothing really embodies like materially those relationships. It's like cotton, the fabric of our lives. We're literally wearing the fruits of the earth. We're literally wearing the labor of many hands and many people that have kind of produced our garments in all different stages. And so we are truly like actually in relationship and connected to those people and that environment, those ecosystems through our clothing. And so, one question that has kind of pushed me in a lot of ways is, how can I be actually clothed in spiritual righteousness if my actual clothing embodies destructive rather than right or good, flourishing relationships? So kind of what's next? Like, where do we go from here? This is it's a big topic, like I said, and it can be heavy because it's huge and interconnected. And so for me, I start with the deep abiding love of God. For God so loved the world, that verse from Hosea, I have loved you with an everlasting love. The great commandments, love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength, and love your neighbor as yourself. Our faith is really foundational to the way we see the world, and not only what needs to change, but a vision for how it could be. Our faith, I think, provides us really compelling and powerful avenues for hope to actually be sustained by the deep abiding love of God in our work for change, and provides us a vision for what these systems and what these relationships could look like that really do embody respect and care and, kind of mutual adoration, if you will, in terms of the way that we view our actual clothes and we view the environment and the people who are involved in making our clothes through all that. And love I think biblically love is not necessarily a weak thing. It's something that requires, empathy and compassion, solidarity and action. It's not just enough that we kind of think of ourselves as a neighbor or think about who our neighbor might be in terms of human and non-human creation, but also that we act like a neighbor. The Good Samaritan showed himself to be a neighbor when he stopped, had compassion, and took action, and kind of made some significant changes based on that. So in that vein, we do have a couple of options and couple of ideas that we could put into action together. Next slide, please. So 2 actions we can do. One is support the Fabric Act, call your elected officials and sign the petition, kind of make it known that you support this piece of legislation. This act introduces new workplace protections and manufacturing incentives that will protect nearly 100,000 American garment workers. And we need more legislation like this. It's been many years since we've had kind of a really robust series of pieces of legislation that really have kind of created significant change in this industry. So this is one important way to kind of walk the talk and kind of support that work that's happening. And the second piece is to divest from fossil fuels in your closet. As I mentioned, a lot of clothing is now made with polyester, which is just one example of an oil-based synthetic. It comes, ultimately it's derived from oil products. And so by choosing not to buy new polyester clothing, it's a way to divest from the fossil fuel industry, which we know is really important in terms of reducing greenhouse gas emissions and things like that. So we can talk a little bit more about that later, but wanted to also put this out there for us. So I wanted to end with this quote from Pope Francis's encyclical Laudato Si, which talks a lot about kind of human, divine, and ecological relationships. The divine and human meet in the slightest detail in the seamless garment of God's creation. And I just felt like this is a powerful way to kind of think about the way that we're all connected, and that our clothing is kind of that physical representation of the way that we are connected to one another. And finally, I do want to just encourage us that caring about our clothes is not a frivolous or superfluous thing. Our clothing has real impact on real people and real ecosystems around the world. And it is a massive industry. I think pre-pandemic estimates are something like $2.5 trillion industry annually. And so if we do come together and make collective action and change, we can really see a significant difference and really live out that neighborly, deep, abiding, divine love of God in our wardrobes. So thanks, y'all. I'm excited to change the world together.
Thank you so much, Lizzy, and thank you for packing so much information into that short amount of time. But I think you really did a good job of talking through every aspect of that, from why we care about climate to what is climate justice to how does clothing play a role. Enjoy some of that creation that we talked about protecting today, and see you all next month.
Thanks for watching one of the 7 episodes of Clothed in Glory. And don't forget to subscribe to support SojoAction's work and see more content like this.